I request Dr. Amarnath Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, to present a bouquet to our esteemed guest, Professor Neelum Saran. Dipali, kindly bring the bouquet to the stage. Thank you, sir. I request Dr. Prashant Kumar Pandey, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, to present a bouquet to our esteemed guest, Professor Farooqi. Now, I request Dr. Umesh Chandra, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, to present a bouquet to our esteemed guest, Professor Prakash Sinha. Thank you, sir. I request Dr. Aloysius Sebastian, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, to present a bouquet to our esteemed guest, Professor Smita Agarwal. Thank you. Now I request Dr. Pramod Kumar Gour, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, to present a bouquet to Professor Prakash Joshi. Thank you. A very good morning to everyone present over here. I, Kanchan Yadav, take this privilege to warmly welcome all the delegates on the second day of the national seminar titled Revisiting History Through Literature, Religion, Politics and Propaganda, organized by Department of English and Modern European Languages, University of Allahabad. A very special thanks to you all for gracing this occasion with your esteemed presence. Yesterday, we had the opportunity to listen to the eminent speakers of international repute, Professor Baran and Professor Harish Trivedi. It was an eventful and a successful day. This is the first session of the second day of the seminar, and I would like to take a few moments in introducing to you our esteemed panel on the dais. I take the privilege of welcoming Professor Neelum Saran, who taught for 44 years in the Department of English, Allahabad University, and retired as professor in 2020. She is the author of 6 novels, 4 short story collections, a translation of her own work into Hindi, and 2 works of non-fiction exploring the literary history and culture of Allahabad. She has been an active book reviewer for numerous papers and journals, including the TLS of the UK. She has also been a columnist for the Allahabad page of the Hindustan Times and for First Post. Her latest novel, Requiem in Rav Janki, won the Hindu Fiction Prize of 2018. Her publishers are Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Rupa Publications, and Mark Publications. Thank you, ma'am, for gracing this occasion with your esteemed presence. I am extremely delighted to welcome Professor Farooqi. She is the younger daughter of Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. She recently obtained voluntary retirement from Jamia, Millia, Islamia and moved permanently to Allahabad. She was a professor of English there. Professor Baran's areas of special interest are Shakespearean drama, translation and women's studies. She has translated extensively from Urdu to English. Thank you, ma'am, for your esteemed presence. Now, I would specially welcome Professor Prakash Sinha, former Professor of Archaeology, Department of Ancient History, Culture and Archaeology, University of Allahabad. Sir is a former University Fellow of College of Humanities, University of Exeter, UK, and former adjunct faculty of National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, India. Currently, he is an executive member of Indo-Pacific Prehistoric Association, Australia. Sir has published and presented nearly 99 research papers in various areas. He has organized a number of workshops on experimental and analytical archaeology in different parts of India and has chaired a number of sessions in national and international seminars and conferences in India and abroad. He has been visiting professor at a number of prestigious institutions. Thank you, sir, for gracing this occasion with your esteemed presence. Now, I take the privilege of welcoming Professor Smita Agarwal, who is a prominent poet, translator, editor, educator, and singer. Professor Agarwal's books are Wish-Granting Words, Mofussil Notebook, and Marginalized Indian Poetry in English. Her latest poetry collection is Speak Woman, published by Red River. Professor Agarwal is also an editor and translator for Platt Profiles, the Sylvia Plath online journal published by Indiana University, USA. She is presently a professor of English at the University of Allahabad. Her songs are available on YouTube and SoundCloud and are translations in Platt Profiles. Her poems have received awards and residencies from the British Council. She is also a Hindustani music vocalist and has performed on All India Radio. We are honored to have your esteemed presence, ma'am. Thank you for being here. This session is moderated by Professor Prakash Joshi, Department of English and Modern European Languages, University of Allahabad. Now I would request Professor Joshi to commence the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Kanju. Let me just first of all explain to you the format of this panel discussion. What we have decided is that in the beginning, to start with, we'll ask each of the panelists to speak somewhere between 12 to 15 minutes. And once that part is over, then there is a possibility of we open this panel of illustrious panelists to talk among themselves and share the insights that emerge during that conversation. And also, the panelists will take questions from the audience. So that is the format. I won't be asking any questions. One of the panelists was asking me whether I would be asking questions or not. No, there won't be any questions for that. Now, if you look at the theme of this seminar, revisiting history through literature. If we have had some brush with the stream called stylistics, we would understand instantly and immediately that the word that gets maximum prominence in the theme is the word history. That is the word that gets foregrounded in the technical jargon of stylistics. So the idea here is to discover, rediscover, and rediscover history via the long route of literature. That's the purpose, that's the idea. But the question that crops up here is, what do we mean and understand by history, by the word history? And the question becomes specifically problematic if we look at different perspectives of and on history and different ways of doing history. For example, there is a book by Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore titled Allahabad Itihas, and that was published in the year 1903. And in that, Rabindranath Tagore writes, and I'm quoting the entire thing, the superstition that history has to be similar in all countries must be abandoned. And after this, he goes on with some mild, amusing illustration and writes, those who give up all hope of Indian history because they fail to find royal genealogies and accounts of conquests and defeats in the Indian official record room and say, how can there be any history when there is no politics? Well, they are the people who look for aubergine in paddy fields. That's Rabindranath Tagore, more than exactly 120 years ago. So, this is an illustration enough to understand that different geographical zones in the world have had their different ways of doing history, and India and China have been those two of those zones that have been doing their histories for centuries in a different way. Well, we'll leave that to our panelists to talk about and handle. But before I ask our first panelist, Professor Neelum Saran Gour, to speak, I would like to share a broad and a comprehensive understanding of history, or the word history, by Jacques Le Goff in his book titled History and Memory, published by the Columbia University Press in 1992. So Jacques Le Goff speaks of three senses of the word history. First is obviously a series of events. Second sense, a narrative of that series of events. But the third one is interesting. He says that this narrative or these narratives can be based either on historical reality or on pure imagination. This might shock many of us. Could history or historical narratives be based on pure imagination too? But that is what Le Goff puts up front here. There's another book by Jean Vanessa titled Oral Traditions as History, and that's published by the University of Wisconsin Press in 1985. And Jan Vanessa explained in that book how stories and tales can also and do serve as authentic historical evidence. So this is the ground, the background, or the code in which this entire discussion will function and move. So, our first speaker, Professor Neelum Saran Gour, will tell us how history comes to us, speaks to us through episodes in literature. Professor Gour.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I audible? When I was still teaching in this university, I used to cover a paper called The 17th Century. And of course it was an entirely Eurocentric study. But a lot of it was not confined to the Western world, because I found it very absorbing to trace the foundations of parliamentary democracy in all its scummy details. And that was when I used to speak about a particular kind of prose called historian's prose. Now this kind of prose was written by most historians, from Thomson down to Toynbee, and even now to our times, Christopher Bailey and others. And if you analyze this kind of prose, it was made up of narrative, reflection, and argument. However, it has always been seen that the real experience of history has not come from this kind of narrative. It has been entirely non-formal, unofficial narratives which have made us live history. Letters, broadsheets, diaries, speeches in the square, sermons, the memoirs of people, pamphlets, even messages of death, even obituaries. So it's like looking at history through the wrong end of the telescope. It is the microvision which enriches our understanding of history rather than the macrovision, and this is where literature comes in. Because these make us live and feel history. They make us experience, rather than what happens, the feelings which people had when they happened. Now, feelings are inappropriate in any rigorous academic study. It's the no man's land between history and literature. But my current favorite is the great Nobel laureate Svetlana Alexievich. And she has a rare take on history. When she is writing history, she includes the voices of housewives, artists, party workers, students, soldiers, traders, living through times of political upheaval. So she covers the period after the fall of the Soviet Union and the decades that followed it. And she calls these polyphonic narratives. I'm not going to quote much, but one vital quotation is, she says, I don't ask people about socialism, about the ideology of socialism, about the politics of the period. I want to know about love, about jealousy, about childhood, about old age. I want to know about the music, the dances, the hairdos, the heartbreak, the myriad details. Because when I'm writing, I'm piecing together what is called domestic or interior history. As history passes through a person's soul. And I've always been drawn to this miniature state, this miniature expanse. One person, one individual, and this is where everything really happens. After all, history does not happen to robots, history happens to human beings. We are all individuals in the mass, and our experience of history, the entire feeling of history, is what literature is all about. Speaking for myself, the great transformative moments of world history have always come to me as paragraphs out of literature. I said I would not use the names of books which nobody has read. Rather, I would reduce it to books which everybody has read. Something which we have known and we can relate to. I speak about three important, heart-beating scenes out of the Tale of Two Cities. I cannot separate the French Revolution from the Tale of Two Cities. You know, Danton, Robespierre, Baran, and Defarge. You know, it doesn't stop with Robespierre. because for me, Madame Defarge is very much part of the landscape of the French Revolution. And there are episodes which come to me heart-throbbingly. One is knives being sharpened, ready for the killing of the innocents, the September killings. Another is very refined captive aristocrats meeting new captives, rising from their chairs and welcoming the new inmates very gentilly. It has a whole story behind it. So, the essence of a great epoch in world history is accessible to my heart, my living experience through literature. I'll go on to another book, which most of us have read, Dr. Shivago, and my students would be familiar with something I'm going to say. The Soviet Union has been formed, the provisional government has been deposed, of course the Tsar is a prisoner, and our protagonist experiences this great moment of history in an individual way. There is street fighting on the streets of Moscow. His child is ill. There is no milk in the house. And he leaves his home desperately in search of a bottle of milk and soda for the feverish child. And as he is passing, a blizzard begins. The snow descends on all sides. There is a cone of light from a lamppost, and a newsboy passes, shouting, "Well, hot from the press, breaking news." And he quickly buys a paper from him, and he freezes, because here is the declaration that the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics has been formed. And he says at that moment he stood stock still. And he said, centuries from now, the world will read about this moment. But here I am in the middle of this moment, living it. There are other realities about all revolutions, all civil wars, which come to me through literature. For example, immediately after the declaration of a classless society, what is the first action which our protagonist has to resort to? He has to go out and steal a log of wood. Now that action says so much in that brief paragraph that volumes cannot summarize the motive behind it, the entire social reshuffle that took place. Small things carry entire historical stories. For example, there is a new mechanic stove. The old porcelain stoves are no longer practical because they consume too much fuel, and the old villas have been given to the proletariat. So now a new contraption is built which does not work. It fills the rooms up with smoke, and when it breaks down, the protagonist calls a mechanic. The mechanic doesn't know how to put it right. Instead, the mechanic turns out to be not a mechanic, but a former philosopher, a former professor of philosophy. So rather than repair a stove, they sit together discussing ethics and aesthetics, and he's an expert on Benedetto Croce. The stove will not work. This stove is the new governmental experiment. The old stove is outmoded, the old forms are gone, but there is nothing satisfactory which will work. What will function? Now, what a powerful idea to be expressed through a single literary allegory. And finally, the most pungent of all, when the entire economic collapse had happened in Russia, barter was the only form of trade, and Tonia, Yuri Zhivago's wife, has no fuel, has no food. They begin selling their things. So she has a beautiful ornamental wooden cabinet which she can't bring herself to smash up for the fire. So she goes out and she brings a peasant. And that peasant likes that little cabinet, and he brings her a cartload of wood. She's quite unhappy at losing this beautiful piece of furniture, and as the peasant casts his eyes around the room, suddenly he catches sight of a piano, and he says, "What will you take for that? Next time, I'll get you a sack of potatoes." And he has to agree. Now, how much has been said? Because the proletariat did not want a classless society. They wanted to be as the upper classes were. The peasant did not know how to play a piano. He had no use for it, but it was a symbol of something that generations of this kind had coveted. So, I just bring you, I don't know whether my time is coming to an end, but these are the little details. You know, the micro-vision that I spoke of, the interiority of the historical experience. All of us inhabit our time. And we can inhabit the experiences of other people, because after all, what is the purpose of all this discourse? The purpose is to know how human beings feel. After all, it would be a sorry world if we were entirely out of sync with other people, all the people whom we other in all our societies. It is by entering into the experience of the others that some kind of positivity can be created in a society. How much time do I have? Oh, I can go on. I would also like to sound a note of caution. We are also familiar with the phenomenon of fake news. And propaganda is one of the subjects covered under this conference. There have been famous cases in which a crypto history or a pseudo history is deliberately created. And this is, again, my students are familiar, we used to speak about Gone with the Wind, and the entire story behind it, because Gone with the Wind, which glorifies a vanished way of life, a dignity, grace, benign slave owners, happy slaves, you know, a certain nobility of the southern states of America. This was entirely a fabricated narrative. There was a movement called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, and they applied themselves very consciously to creating literature around what they called the lost cause. The lost cause was the downfall of the Deep South. They were committed to glorifying monuments, they were committed to glorifying relics of the Ku Klux Klan, and to propagate the myth of the paternalistic, solicitous slave owner, you know, and the family connections between the slaves and the masters. And this was addressed with such efficiency that an entire literature came about. Now, when we think of the American Civil War, we think of, what do we see? You know, Lee's armies on the back foot. We see Scarlett O'Hara starving. We see her hiding under a bridge as the Yankee army marches over the bridge. We see Atlanta in flames. But we must also know that a lot of this was part of a political agenda. So what I have been saying applies 90% of the time, but 10% it is always often a part of a very, very deliberate political agenda. And it is up to the discerning reader and the historian to discriminate between the two. That will be all. Thank you very much.
I don't have to comment on what Professor Gour has explained to us, but then what she tells us about fake history is, in a way, a continuation of what Professor Baran in his keynote speech yesterday, mentioned. He did mention something about political agenda playing a role in the creation of history. But then Professor Gour doesn't mince words, and she, well, straightforwardly calls them fake history, which it is. Another interesting point she makes here is about macro and micro visions of history. And she's so perceptively makes this point that literature does brings to us the macro vision of history. And in a way, the two examples she took up, one from the Tale of Two Cities and Dr. Zhivago, how these works are not histories of royal genealogies, of conquests, etc. They are the histories of the people who should matter, must matter. Thank you, Professor Gour. There is a book by Anne Cathoys titled, Is History Fiction? So in the introduction of the book, on page number 3, page 3 is a problematic term, but then it is there on page 3 of the introduction in the book. Anne Cathoys asks a series of probing questions. I'll read out that series to you. And listen to this series of questions which she raises in this book. Can historians tell the truth about the past? Should history be written for the present, for its own sake? Is it possible to see the past in its own terms? Should we make moral judgments about people and actions in the past? It's a very loaded question. Are histories shaped by narrative conventions so that their meaning derives from their form rather than the past itself? If we start answering these questions, we'll be needing 7 days, not just one session. So, I leave these questions to you, with you, to think about and cudgel your brains with. But then, the last question here throws up the crucial word, the neutral and incorporative word narrative. And that is the word which gives us our clue to what Professor Farooqi has to speak on and about. She intends to look into some non-literary narratives from the Indian subcontinent. Very interesting histories she's going to tell us about.
Let me begin by thanking the Department of English of the University of Allahabad for having thought of me and asking me to participate in this panel discussion. As I have been a student of this university and have carried this label along with me all my life, and I taught at Jamia, Millia, Islamia, Department of English, and defended the university and stood up for it all my life, and I'm really delighted to be here today. I did come here for some vivas, PhD vivas, for which not my professors, they are my PDs, they called me a couple of times, more than a couple of times, but I am really elated to be here today. And so thank you, Dr. Dwivedi and the entire department. So let me begin by saying that, in the recent past, we have been witness to a number of so-called narratives, or they can be called maybe histories, which are written like narratives or even biographies, which have kind of given us an opportunity to know people who kind of created history or who were responsible for creating certain circumstances or events or giving rise to events, but they were not in the limelight as such, and even those who were in the limelight. We've got a more nuanced picture of them through this kind of writing. And it's almost like, the authors have allowed us to walk in the footsteps of those who were creating history at that time, or who were in a position to create history, we may say, because as we all understand that history is created by very fluid circumstances, and history is closely akin to literature in the sense that history tells us what happened, while literature tells us what might have happened. So now when we carry out a fusion of history with literature, we see that, I mean, by literature I mean the non-fiction prose of a narrative form. We are given the hows and whys of history. So, in a way, what might have happened and what actually happened is given a reason. It's given some kind of at least a narrative around it where we can see what could have been the diverse and various and multiple circumstances and traditions and customs which might have led to certain events taking place in history. So I remember that when I was starting out with my PhD, and it was on the 19th century criticism of Shakespeare, my father told me that one thing that you have to do if you want to write a good thesis is to make friends with all these people who you are going to write about. So, he told me a couple of anecdotes about how talkative Coleridge was, and how, if he would catch hold, if he wanted to, once, one of his contemporaries, I forget the name, he met them on the street, and he would catch that person's collar and then go on talking for hours. So that picture kind of never left me, and so he told me that, you have to talk to them every day, you have to know them like real people. And then only you can attempt a kind of an analysis of the 19th century criticism of Shakespeare, which was in a way revolutionary, and it reinstated Shakespeare as the be-all and end-all of English drama. So I'm strongly reminded of what he said, because I didn't quite understand what he meant by that. But gradually, as I became more familiar, I read more and more, and I realized that biographies also can be, either very, kind of technical and matter of fact, or they can be nuanced, and they can have some kind of empathy and compassion in them, and also acknowledge that the biographies that are being written are of human beings, and human beings can be frail, they have their flaws, they have their frailties, they are humorous, they are compassionate, they can be angry. So as recently I was reading a kind of an obituary that Namita Gokhale has written about her son-in-law Patrick French, who passed away last week, and she says that she wants to, I really liked the way she describes him as a biographer. She says that he's a biographer and historian at the same time, and he gives us a history of people, not events, and his writing displays an empathy as well as erudition. So in that sense, Patrick French, who's written a history of, modern India coming into existence, with the time when the British were deciding to withdraw and India was about to gain independence. His version of the entire thing is far more empathetic than any history that we might have read in our schools and colleges. So this, kind of struck a chord with me, because I have been thinking a lot about, books written by I can't call them historians, like authors like Ira Mukoti and Parvati Sharma. And Parvati Sharma, I remember she says somewhere in her introduction or wherever that, she's a novelist originally, and then she suddenly decides to write a book on Jahangir. So she says that, how does a novelist write about, facts? So, because, and then, in order to quote her, I wrote it down. She says, having spent much of my life trying to learn the art of fiction, how now to tell a story that is a fact? So, so I really found that interesting, that, and then she says that, and so this story, which was to be factual in a way. So she says that it had to be accurate as well as engaging. And so here is a novelist writing a history of we can say, a slightly mysterious figure, Jahangir, who had this very powerful consort, Noor Jahan, who was so powerful at one point of time in the Mughal Empire that she actually had coins, minted with her image and with her name. So she says that that what is the difference between a technical history book and a narrative? And Parvati tells us that say a narrative begins with that this happened and this happened and then this happened until you build up a world. And if you're lucky, that world is truthful. So it's like, it's like a story which is truthful. And of course, we have this age-old understanding in this part of the world, I mean the Indian subcontinent, that all stories are true. So, so in that case, it becomes a very interesting, kind of combination of truth, which is written in an engaging and interesting manner, and it is giving rise to a whole world. So this is, Parvati has got a lot of praise for having having recalled an India which was religiously tolerant and reasonably open and pluralistic, and the important role of women in governance during Mughal times is especially brought into focus by Parvati Sharma. And the reader is, pleasantly surprised to see what was going on inside the harem, unlike the kind of impression that the British had chosen to give about the harem as a debauched and lecherous place. And while the harem was a very orderly place where there were women of all kinds, there were sisters, there were widows of kings, there were friends, women of friends or noblemen who no longer had a family or a husband, and of course there were wives and daughters. So and also like as Ira tells us that whenever there is a mention of the emperor having gone into the Zanana, it's not supposed to be a mention saying, in the sense that he's gone there to have sex with a dozen wives. It's a place where he is safe, where he knows that nobody is going to come and interrupt him with some kind of good or bad news, or where he will not be attacked most of the times. And he can, so therefore it used to be a place where, where all the political discussions and the debates and what you call it, mind, jogging of the mind would be done, because when the king would retire into the Zanana, not retire but visit the Zanana, often the important pieces of information which he would want to discuss with his higher level ministers would be told to him at that time, and mind you, the women would be privy to all that. And the women would be, in many cases, like that, for instance, the example of Hamida Banu Begum, she was Akbar's mother, or the case of Harka Bai, who is, by some strange reason, whose name has gone down with readers as Jodha Bai, and so she would be around, or there would be the nurse mothers, would be present, and there would be all kinds of sisters, for instance. You have Humayun's sister, Gulbadan Begum, a very influential woman, but you never went into questioning how Gulbadan Begum could be so educated and so well trained in the art of writing and in history that she was actually commissioned to write the Humayunama by her half-brother Humayun. So you can imagine the kind of learning that these women had and how they were therefore instrumental in creating the ambience of the empire and how they were instrumental in we can say supporting or not supporting a particular prince for ascending to the kingdom. For instance, we know that Aurangzeb had his brother Dara Shikoh killed, and since Dara Shikoh was strongly supported by his sister Jahan Begum, she was greatly annoyed with him, and he actually castigated her, and he kept her within the confines of the palace because he kind of imprisoned her for some years. So you understand that her support must have been so important that it was very necessary to curb the women in the empire, in the dynasty, from exerting their influence beyond a point, because we often see that the Mughal Empire was an empire where the war of ascension was something which was generally, one was expected to contend with one's own brothers, but it was not expected all the time that there would be murder. But then once in a while, some odd king would also, could also get his brothers killed, like Aurangzeb did, or blinded. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to understand how and why these events came about. And Ira Mukherjee has been instrumental, in her book called The Daughters of the Sun, and then another book called Heroines. And she has given us in great detail the lives of certain very important women in the Mughal dynasty. And she begins with telling us that Babur, when he was coming to India, they were still, they would trace their ancestry to the Timurids, who were, as we know, nomadic, and they were not the kind of clan, the race that would settle in one place. But it's only with Babur that a change kind of comes about, and Babur tries to stabilize himself in the Hindustan of that time. And there was a time when he lost Afghanistan, and those, I'm not very accurate with my geography or with the dates, but at one point of time it so happened that he had to marry his very dear sister to his enemy in order to be able to escape from the siege to which he had been put. And so I think the name of that sister was I'll just see if I've written it down. No, I don't have the name. I think it was Kha Zamani Begum or something. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the exact name. And it's very interesting to see how each and every woman was given titles. And they had their entire identity, and they had several names. And when they would actually reach a position of power, say for instance when Mumtaz Mahal died, when she was giving birth to her 14th child, Jahan Ara Begum was the eldest daughter, and she was 17 years old at that time. But since there was no other woman who could replace her, because Mumtaz Mahal was so beloved of Shah Jahan that he could not imagine that any other woman amongst his wives could take her place. That Jahara Begum was made we could say that she was the master of affairs in that sense, and she was immediately given the title of Badshah Begum. So Badshah Begum or Begum Sahiba, though she was just 20, and it turns out that she never married. And though she never married, she was never ever looked down upon for that. And she continued to, she was, as Ira Mukherjee tells us, that India at that point of time under Shah Jahan was the wealthiest region of the world. The per capita income of the Mughal, of citizens of the Mughal Empire was about 100-fold that of an average British. And when the British arrived in the Mughal court, they were so overawed that it took them a long time to understand what was going on, and they would write back to their homelands with such awe about the kind of wealth and opulence that the dynasty had. So here, what I was trying to say was that Jahara Begum inherited 50% of Mumtaz Mahal's wealth, and then she increased her wealth so much that that she ultimately became the most powerful and the richest woman in the world. And at that point of time, her wealth has been estimated as over a crore of rupees at that point of time. So we can imagine how the likes of historians, or we can say though Ira Mukherjee was studied natural sciences at Cambridge, and in one of her interviews she says that though I am a scientist and I've studied natural science, I feel that my training as a natural scientist has helped me to write what I have written about these women. And she says that she was also kind of provoked into writing about the women of India. It would be a Meera or a Razia Sultan or a Rani Lakshmi Bai, or the women of the Mughal Empire, because there were many of them and who continued, over a period of about 200 years. That, the famous Nirbhaya rape case, outside a cinema hall, and several other such cases she has cited, saying that, when this can still happen to girls, to a girl or a woman in India, in Delhi, then we really need to look at, are we more powerful today, or were the women of those times better off? And so how much time have I taken? No, I mean, is my time over? Because I'm very passionate about this subject, so I just go on. Yeah, I can wind up in 2 more minutes. What I was saying was that these women, they were not objects of, they were not just sex symbols, or they were not, none of these women. For that matter, she mentions Rani Lakshmi Bai in her other book, Hymns, and she says that Rani Lakshmi Bai's image has been, she has been completely, kind of disempowered by projecting her merely as a widow and a mother. So what happens is that you keep on talking about her as a mother or as a widow, because she went unaccompanied into the battlefield, and she fought bravely. She spent nights alone in the jungle, finally to disappear into legend, because we don't really know how she died or when she died. But here is this brave woman who must have had a dazzling personality and identity of her own, and intelligence, where she could think, she could decide what she wants to do. Or even Begum Hazrat Meher, who was actually a courtesan earlier, but that is never mentioned easily, unless you go into great detail. Then only you get to know that she was a courtesan, or she was of black origin, she was dark, and maybe her features were not so Indian times, but then she was so very talented in singing and dancing that she was given the designation of Pari, Nawab Wajid Ali Shah had these Paris. So all I'm saying, finally, just to wind up, is that that these women, they are, in a way, if there is any word for feminine word for emasculated, in the sense that they have been just restricted to certain categories. And that is all the time that they are fighting for the nation, or they are fighting the war of freedom, 1857, blah blah. But there is no recognition of the region they come from, or what were their particular circumstances, and for how long did they last, and what prompted them to go into the battlefield alone. Or Razia Sultan, for that matter, immediately if you make a film about them, or you write a fictional book, you will, most of most of the movie will go into her amorous encounter with that black slave. But that is not the only aspect to her. In fact, that aspect shows how much she was in control of her destiny, how she could choose. These are the small little points that I'm trying to say, that these are history and literature. They get intertwined and they give rise to story, which is different, which is a different kind of story, which is accurate, but it is a literary thing at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Farooqi. It has turned into a beautiful plenary speech, in fact. Hidden histories, brushed under the carpet histories, histories in the harems or harems, whichever pronunciation you prefer. And certainly those harems were the extensions of the political space of the court, and so many imperial royal decisions actually materialized, and they happened there in the harems. And probably the courts were the places where they were just embossed with some kind of seal. And very interesting and meaningful insight by reference to these two sources that Professor Farooqi has mentioned. And also this interesting wedding connection, marriage of technical history and narrative that I think most of us would have loved it. A narrative begins. We are so familiar with our style of story writing that we say, once upon a time, this happened, and this happened, and then this happened. This is how a narrative begins, and then, as Professor Farooqi says, if it turns out to be truthful, it becomes history. Otherwise, it becomes a story. Very interesting. And then, yes, of course, biographies are also that genre are those places where histories remain buried or hidden to be discovered. Thank you very much, Professor Farooqi. There is a word in our contemporary politically charged atmosphere, and that the word we frequently encounter, and this word has earned an international notoriety or international reputation, and the word is woke. Yesterday also this word was used somewhere off stage. So the word began in a very sensible, meaningful manner, and it only meant awakening against racism. That was the meaning of the word originally. But in our recent years, it has turned into a term that denotes an extremist ideology. So this word has an interesting history of this development. Professor Prakash Sinha intends to deal with the original, the less politically charged sense of the word, and he intends to speak on the latest trends in wokeism, and he has a subtitle for his brief talk, which is Critical Race Theory. Professor Sinha.
Well, I found myself arrested by this as a historian, and historian of the period when the Stone Age was there. So at that time there was no literature, no script, only sketches, only graphics. But when the question arises, what is history? To the best of my understanding, any action by the human beings is a part and parcel of record, provided it reaches to the masses. Now, what material reaches to the masses? Who provide the material to the masses? how we reconstruct, I mean, just as a student of history or archaeology, how we reconstruct the history. From where we got the information that the Jodhabai's name was different, or some other personalities of our historical records. So it means that first we had to collect information, primary sources, primary data from the primary sources. Then only we can. And now, when some records have been collected, now comes the context, religion, and propaganda. Unless until we have any verified historical facts, it is very difficult to play as a tool for the religion or politics. Now we have a number of reports, for example, in Indian context. Now there is, because when we approach to the historical facts, whether literary or archaeological, we have something in our mind. We plan how to fix so many issues. Whether that is a political issue of that time, social, religious, we make number of distractions, models to reach to the facts. But definitely everybody knows, as earlier the Plato and Aristotle called history and literature. Now we believe that there is some thin line between history and literature. As some of the speakers have already said, the history is not the facts. But who said that this is the fact? We have to verify from different sources, different contemporary sources. Then only we say this may be treated, or this literature may be treated as historical literature. Now, when we have some verified resources at our disposal, and then comes the word of Islamia, revisited. It means earlier we have visited. Those are not facts or historical facts. Then what is the point of revisiting? Are we going to spread the propaganda, having something in our mind, maybe the politics or the religion? Because these are the two tools through which you can play with the masses. What most of the politicians are doing, not only in India, all over the world. Whether it is a bad or the Trump. Now here comes the fact that as a neutral historian, our goal is very important, very significant. We don't have to be trapped by, sorry to say, by the friction writers. Writing on the memories, unless until we definitely verify. Nowadays, the number of tools and techniques are available for the scientific verification of certain data, and the literature, even the paper. So we are in comparison to earlier period, we are in better position to fix our historical facts. Now the major problem is not from rewriting history, reconstruction of the past, or revisiting. Now there is a very proper approach to history is, and most of us know about that is a Marxist approach to history. And that philosophy, philosophy is mainly based on, I think, two important pillars, haves and have. And that is on the basis of economics. Now this was the earlier tool to understand the past. Now this tool has been used a number of times in different formats. Now the latest term, or at least a decade now, is a critical race especially by the English. American, especially the Marxist students, what they call themselves liberal, progressive liberal. Now there is another one they added to that is a progressive liberal. Now they are writing this. An interesting point to come to that, how they are tracing the idea of this, not from America itself, but from Indian literature. Oldest literature of this land, that is Vedas. They are tracing the roots of this racial feeling. Definitely everybody knows that conflict between the black and white. In America, right from the revolution, the American Revolution. Now this critical racial theory said that they replaced rich and poor from white and black. And they said the black should go up. And they should challenge all the arguments of the white. Right? No problem. But they should challenge the individual or they should challenge the identity of the group of the blacks or white. That is the reason. If I committed some crime, I should be punished. Why all white people? Now comes another step, the further identity. And they said that there is an intersectionality. Now I am black, so I am oppressed, and whites are oppressed. Okay? Now because I am black woman, therefore I am doubly oppressed. How this type of approach will help us in reconstructing or revisiting the history? That is my simple question for this audience. Now, in Indian context, they replace the word race with caste. Now, and just model is the same. And how this philosophy of this approach reached to West or Europe or America is very interesting made by such scholars. That Vedic literature was read by the Britishers. And with this knowledge they reached to America. So the roots of this racism of casteism are from the Vedic literature. And they imposed colonialism, and because they are against white, so that they are colonizers. But the same principle they are not applying in Indian context. A number of invaders came here, made us colony, and they are not condemning themselves. They colonize us. So this type of approach, how far we will be able to really reconstruct or reach up to the truth of the past? Then comes another approach. Further extension of CR critical race theory is cancel theory. They said, if you are suggesting that, right? If I am saying something that goes against the plan or oppressed, they are free to reject it. And then that point the word cancel. My way. So this type of the approach and what they are really planning is to reach all the important offices of this continent or and this approach, as Prakash said, that this China and India economically and globally to some extent are at conflict. And this type of the approach in Europe and USA is totally supported by Chinese. But think that China is a communist country and they are not accepting this critical racial theory. They block them. They put an approach in China. They accepted capitalism, as most of us know, and that is why it is one of the top rich country nowadays. They accepted capitalism, but under the control of communism. They are not free. And they are providing funds to such people. So what is their interest is, and to some extent is the interest of the Western countries also, destroy structure, social structure in our country. And for that, because what they say in the cancel theory is reject their suggestions, revolt against that. But if you study all the Marxist approach, they follow thesis, obligous thesis, antithesis, but never reach to the synthesis. They never reach to the synthesis. They will destruct all the structures, I mean the social structure, and then they will come and rule us. But this is one of the interpretations made by not a number of scholars nowadays. And they are sending such trained person in the high offices because it has been mentioned by Rajiv Malhotra and Vijay, something like that. They are author of a book, very famous book nowadays, very popular and debating. Snakes
In the Ganga. Snakes in the Ganga.
They discuss all about this with suitable examples. And they mention what they mentioned, therefore I am daring to give the name. And one person named Sinha is a member of Millia, and he is one of the champions of such approach. So like this, they are reaching the heart of this, so that they can twist the second point, the politics of this country. Change the policies of this country. So this history is in making in India. Therefore, I thought that after seeing the typing of this not that instead of talking too much, why not evoke you against such evocation? And remember that our CGI is also from the Harvard University. And the Harvard University and Berkeley, Oxford are champion in this. They are spreading this idea. think I will love to discuss, if any. And once again, I am very grateful that the literary persons, I am familiar with the literary person, and just providing, I mean, the students are just providing material to them for right program. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sinha. Professor Sinha has boldly asked some very uncomfortable questions, and I'm very certain these uncomfortable questions are going to create some interest here, and questions are already there in the minds of some people, I believe, because of these uncomfortable questions. But I'll begin with what he spoke of about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This troubled times of political, ideological polarization, are we actually thinking of synthesis, one, and two, is synthesis at all possible? Is it or is it not? That could be a big question again. Or would people want synthesis? Would it be in their interest if synthesis happens? Would it be destructive, damaging to their politics? On both sides of the divide, how many would want that synthesis to happen? Will it destroy, damage their industry and their interest or whatever? So, and also Professor Sinha spoke about the labeling of history, and he gave just one example, one kind of labeling. It's a Marxist history, which is entirely based on the economic shape, character of a society, and then the Marxists, he says, do not. They have progressed in a way and call themselves progressive liberals, etc. So in this scenario where synthesis looks highly unlikely, is there any neutral history possible? This is a question which emerges from all that Professor Sinha has spoken about. And then when he began, he began by talking about what reaches the masses. Do masses matter? And I leave this question for you to think about. Do they really matter? Have they ever mattered? Even in the 19th century, when this kind of history was beginning to grow. Now moving to the next part. Does poetry, we are still in the domain of this cusp between history and literature. Does poetry tell history? Well, if someone asked this question, there would be a loud answer in chorus, and the answer would be yes, and there will be examples cited of poems like Iliad or Aeneid and Mahabharata and Jayasi's Padmavat. So let's modify this question. And the modified question would be, does or can subjective, intensely personalized poetry does or can tell history? And the next question, if yes, if this kind of highly personal poetry can tell history, then what kind of history would that subjective, personal poetry tell? So we'll have some answers to these questions in what Professor Smita Agarwal has to say, with specific reference to Sylvia Plath. Of course, she'll be making other more references to Professor Agarwal.
Thank you, Prakash. I will not be giving you any answers. I'm just going to be raising some questions and wanting you to think about the questions that I raise. But before I begin, I need to, from the bottom of my heart, thank the newly appointed faculty of the Department of English, University of Allahabad, for giving me this last opportunity of grandstanding before I am consigned to the annals of history of this department. So thank you so much for having me here, and also thank you to the university, and the Vice Chancellor and the entire university faculty and staff who have made this possible for us to be here. Made it possible for us to be here. So now to come to the topic of the panel discussion. Yesterday morning, we heard very deeply researched, well-organized, and well thought out presentations, lectures, talk, whatever you want to call them, by both Professor Harish Trivedi and Professor Baran. But it was in the evening, in the unaupcharik and the informal conversation that Dr. Vivek Dwivedi and I were privy to, that got me thinking and made me realize that, as Farooqi said just now, maybe biography and autobiography are the spaces where history and literature may come together comfortably. This is because we were hearing a lot, Vivek and I were hearing a lot about, Agye and his relationship with Kapila Vatsyayanji, and what somebody I've forgotten all those names since I'm not an expert in that area, but somebody in the Hindi world had written a biography like this, and somebody had written a biography like this in English. So then that's what made me think that perhaps this is the space where these two streams may blend together comfortably. Having said that, let me come to what I'm supposed to be talking about, and I'm going to be putting before you a case study. In a way, a case study regarding Sylvia Plath's two very iconic poems, Daddy and Lady Lazarus, that we teach in our undergraduate courses, that we study in our postgraduate courses. These two are famous, iconic poems of that young lady who committed suicide at the age of 32. Now, these poems give me, at least me, a wonderful insight into how the creative imagination may work with history. Both these poems, the bedrock of both these poems, the foundational idea of both these poems is the Nazi-Jew conflict. And this Nazi-Jew conflict she uses as a metaphor to talk about real people in her life in a deeply fictional manner. She talks about real people in her life, like her daddy, like her husband, and the other male friends that she had. She talks about these real people. She uses them as a fictional resource. She creates caricatures of them. She distorts their personalities. She lashes out. She rants against these male characters. And in order to concretize her deeply felt angst, her deeply felt ideas of victimization and oppression, she uses the metaphor of the Nazi-Jew conflict. And the poems have such an immediacy in them that the uninitiated reader who is not going to do a PhD or write a paper on Sylvia Plath, the common reader will read the poems and then go back thinking, rightly so, that she has suffered during the Nazi era in Europe, especially because she has the name Sylvia Plath and she has German ancestry. Her father was German, Otto Plath, her father was German, and they migrated from a very poor region of Poland called Posen. The Plath family migrated to America in the 1900s. The great-grandfather was an illiterate farmer who, along with a load of his relatives, came to America for economic reasons to make a better life for themselves. So they came from Posen in Poland to America. They were German. They lived there. And we see that as the family history unfolds, that there is this grandfather, great-grandfather, who works at menial jobs, like, lugging sacks of grain from one truck to the ground, or from the ground to loading them onto the truck, and doing other odd jobs like a carpenter or a mason or whatever. From that, then there is not much known about the grandfather, but then we have Otto Plath, who is a Harvard professor, and then we have Sylvia Plath, who continues to hold the position of one of the most eminent poets that America has produced. So if the family has moved to the Americas in the 1900s, 3 generations ago, then how is Plath talking with such authority and with such immediacy about this whole Nazi Jew situation? And paradoxically, in the poem, the father is being, Otto Plath is being called a German, he's being called a vampire, he's being called a Lucifer, he's being called Herr Doctor, whatnot. All sorts of names are being used for him. Eventually, she even calls him a bastard. She says, "Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through with you." So there we have in these poems Daddy slash her husband or slash any other male character who is an authority figure, who is totalitarian, who is torturing, victimizing, oppressing this poor soul. Okay, and written with great immediacy. So obviously then you start thinking, where has she read history book and got all those details? There are specific concentration camps that are mentioned. A train, an engine carrying me off to Dachau, to Auschwitz, to Belsen. Okay. So where has she got all these details from? When during the World War she herself is living in America. And then the other interesting fact is that Otto Black in Daddy is called a Aryan, he's called a fascist, he's called a Nazi. But Otto Black, the father, renounced his German citizenship in 1926 when while living in America, he watched with horror the rise of Hitler. So this German identity has more or less been shed, and yet Black is embracing it in order to vocalize her own psychological discomfiture. Okay. The other interesting thing that we then find out is from where did Black get all these details? And then we come to the Sotan, as they say in Black's life, to the other woman in Black's life, Asya Goodman, because of which Black's marriage with Ted Hughes broke up, and because of which eventually led to Black's suicide because she was in such a phase of depression. It is, interestingly enough, it is Asya Goodman who has, on a first-hand basis, undergone the trials and the tribulations of Nazi oppression. Asya Goodman, who later became Asya Weaver, she was the daughter of a Russian Jew living in Berlin. Her father was a Russian Jew. He was a doctor. They were living in Berlin. The mother was a nurse. Then in the 1930s, all this fascism and all this Nazism began. And like so many other families living there at that time, the Goodmans also started fearing for themselves, for their future, for their lives. And Asya, as a child, is privy to the anxiety and the fear of her parents. Despite the mother being a German, they, like the other Jews living in Berlin at that time, they feel that it's about time that they looked at this issue with concentration and decided what they wanted to do with their lives if they wanted to survive. So a whole load of them, about 25,000 of them, one day in May 1933, boarded a train from Berlin to Switzerland and from Switzerland to Pisa, Italy, which had become a refugee center for Jews fleeing from Germany. Then they lived in Pisa, Look at me thinking of food. They lived in Pisa. They lived in Pisa for 2 or 3 years before they went off to Tel Aviv. Now, Asya visited, or rather, she used to live with the Hughes in Devon. During the period 1961 and 63, the Weevils had become friends with the Hughes, and Asya and her husband would come to the Hughes cottage in Devon, and they would be living together. And there were these coffee table talks between Asya and Sylvia Plath that happened. And Asya would narrate to Plath whatever her remembrance of that horrible time was. So Asya is the one who tells Plath about how they escaped from Berlin to Pisa, of how when they were on the train, of how when they were in Berlin, you know, the Nazis would come and knock on their door and say insulting things and make crosses on the door and generally intimidate the Jews. And then on that eve when they were escaping on the train, Asya recalled or recounted to Black how the Nazi groups walked all down the train carriages while they hid under the seat of the compartment. So this is a 6-year-old child, Asya, remembering that trauma. And in 1954, Asya revisited Pisa and then she went back to Berlin. And in that trip, she found out that her father's brother, who had stayed back in Germany, was killed by the Nazis. And the brother's wife was also murdered, and the brother's little baby was also murdered. So for Asya Goodman, it is a personal experience of terror and trauma that she is recounting to her supposed friend at that moment, Sylvia Plath. Okay, yeah, I'm just finding her. She is recounting to Plath. And Plath, who has never, ever historically faced this situation, cannibalizes all this information, ingests all this information, and creates these literary pieces for us. So what I'm trying to say is that we may think upon this, you know, of how historical facts may not belong to the individual per se. They may belong to anyone, they may come at you from anywhere. But it is the writer's imagination or the artist's creativity that twists and turns and distorts and blends and does whatever they feel like to create a piece of work that comes across to us as real, as history. And this can make us think of all the sources of history. After all, this is also a source of history. And how history may be fictionalized and how it may be vice versa. So I think this is what the panel discussion and what the seminar was asking us to cogitate upon and think upon. And I've been shown the slip. I have some more things to say, but I think I should say namaste and thank you to you all, and now I shut myself.
It was, I had given a slip by the organizers, so I had to just pass on. I was just passing on to you. You were so lost in your speech that you didn't see how I was being instructed. But anyway, what I noticed here is a very interesting kind of cycle, sort of closing. Professor Neelum, Saran, Gour spoke about moments that we gather from works of creative writing, from literary pieces, and they are histories. Whether historians call them verified history or not verified history is a phrase that Professor Prakash Sinha is using. An interesting cycle that we didn't plan it, but it has happened so nicely. But then this last part, which I would like to talk about, not talk about, just sort of highlight or underline, that all that works of literature narrate, they somehow, they come to them through their experiences or through their readings. Now, when she was talking about the poems of Sylvia Plath, I was wondering how the likeness or the comparison can be taken to the computer technology where you have on a page a hyperlink, and you click on that hyperlink, and then you move to the next page, more hyperlinks, and you move to next pages. This is how these beautiful poems work, as you explained. How many histories, personal, social, political, regional, geographical, racial, how many of them embedded in those poems? So that, in a way, an interesting way of revisiting history. What I find again interesting is that in some ways, Professor Smita Agarwal began by saying that she wouldn't be answering any questions, but she ended up answering a question that Professor Sinha had raised. Well, now I'll do something very nasty here. And the nasty is that I had laid down the housekeeping rules of the format, and I'd said that we would open this panel for discussions. We will. But there is a little problem. Professor Prakash Sinha has a conference, a seminar in his own department. So, if there are any questions, well, they should, in the audience, Professor Neelum has to ask some questions, but all questions for Professor Sinha first, so that he can leave to join the seminar in his own department. Yes.
I'm going to use a number of problematic words. And the problematic word for Professor Sinha is fact. And he talks about facts being verified. I think back to the conclusive paragraph of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He said, I have written this massive tome. And as I was finishing, there were sounds of a brawl out in the lane. People were, fighting. There were fisticuffs. And when I made inquiries, I got 6 different accounts. There were 6 different recountings of what had happened, because it had all passed through a subjectivity filter. Everything is contoured by subjectivity. There is no empirical laboratory method for testing history unless you put everybody through a narco test. And we don't know how far that works. The only thing we count on is reportage and the authority of witnesses and how far there is a consensus. So what do we mean by objectivity? I think objectivity is only a consensus of several subjectivities. So that is my question about your definition of fact.
I think I never provided any definition for the fact. The fact is that this is the fact that I never provided any definition for the fact. Number 1. Number 2, what is fact? It is a subject. It depends upon from where we are getting or retrieving the information. What is its context? If it is verifiable by other context, the same thing, then we said this is the nearer to the truth. But nearer to the truth, it is still not truth.
Can I ask a question? No?
I'm not. I'm getting constant instructions like
We began late.
Yes.
I just have a small objection saying that, when you say that all revisiting is politically motivated, I want to. You said, I think so I felt that, it's doing a lot of injustice to the theme of the seminar and to many, many great writers and historians who are trying to speak from the subaltern point of view. And when you say that black women are oppressed and what nonsense is this, I take objection to that.
Okay, now the question is that whether I said all revisiting is politically motivated. Oh, okay. No, definitely when you are saying I am accepting this, no problem. Because if you are revisiting some facts, it means you have some certain idea or motive behind that. you
No,
are.
not facts. Just trying to discover more things around it.
And so it is you know something before about that fact. Right? You are either verifying or you are approaching the same with some different model or different approach. So the moment we are approaching it the same thing, having some other idea or interpretation that may be covered by the religion or politics, this may be the factor because human thinking is not isolated. Even if I am writing or anybody is writing based on certain so-called facts, is that he has some, because nobody is writing, even the literate person is not writing anything in vacuum.
Yes.
He has been brought up in certain socio-economic, psychological environment.
Even the courts of justice try to find out the whys and the hows. So revisiting is more about finding out the how and the why, not politically motivated.
I said it brought into our approach. Because if somebody has written something following some order or some approach, if I am revisiting that with a different model, it means something is in our mind. And here comes the cognition. Cognitive approaches to the history and cognitive approaches to the facts.
I have to apologize to the audience, but then I can't tell you how much of heat I'm feeling on my back constantly. And this is, I think, a very unpleasant duty for the moderator to do. So the situation is that Professor Neelum Gour is our Professor Neelum Gour, Professor Baran Farooqi is our Professor Baran Farooqi, and Professor Smita Agarwal is our Professor Smita Agarwal, and so is Professor Sinha. All of them are here. So I've been told that if audience, anyone of them, have any questions to ask them, they can ask them afterwards so that this session can be wound up. Thank you very much. And now I ask Dr. Kantan to please take over.
Thank you, sir. It was such a wonderful session. We had the opportunity to have an understanding of the topic from 4 different perspectives. The views and ideas shared during this interaction have added various new dimensions for deliberation on the topic. Now, it's time for us to present the dignitaries with a token of appreciation. I request Dr. Amarnath Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, to present a memento to our esteemed guest, Professor Neelum Saran. I request Dr. Prashant Kumar Pandey, Assistant Professor, Department of English and MEL, to present a memento and kit to our esteemed guest, Professor Baran Farooqi. Prashant. Now, I request Dr. Umesh Chandra, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, to present a memento and kit to our esteemed guest, Professor Prakash Sinha. Dr. Umesh. Dr. Aloysius Sebastian, Assistant Professor, Department of English and MEL, to present a memento and kit to our esteemed guest, Professor Smita Agarwal. But today we consider you as guests. Now I request Dr. Prashant, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to propose formal vote of thanks.
So, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by quoting Hegel, because as a student of Hegel, I have probably the moral right to do that. And he says, from history, we learn that we do not learn from history. For me, since I come from the home of Romila and Vipanchandra, so for me, history is an attempt to study the past in order to understand the present and also probably to shape the future. All other disciplines like literature, sociology, political science, they have their roles. But then in my opinion, they have limited roles. And our professional historians, they have the methods and through these methods, they can even theorize these literatures. I would like to thank Professor Gour, Professor Agarwal, Professor Farooqi, Professor Sinha, Professor Prakash Joshi, and everyone else present in the hall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Prashant. Now it's time for the tea break. So I would like to request all the delegates and guests to move towards the tea counter. We will assemble here in 15 minutes for the next session. Thank you.